I'm not sure that Donald Trump saying it or saying it louder or shortening the number of days is what's going to make the difference. I hope what Donald Trump is learning and seeing is that the United States is much stronger in whatever it says and whatever it moves to do when we have friends and allies with us who are like-minded in approach. And it's worth nurturing and building and spending time and attention with those relationships. And I hope some of what we're seeing from him is a result of that.
Well, but what will the result of that ultimately be, Mara? It's one thing for President Trump's attitude to change. It's entirely another for President Putin's. Do you expect that will happen?
Well, I think President Putin is constantly, not unlike President Trump, calculating where his interests lie and how to achieve them. And so the question of secondary sanctions, of how much pain, frankly, can be inflicted on the Russian economy and the extent to which there's the capacity to keep or limit China from helping or bailing out Russia in the way that they have. All of those things are going to factor into whether we ultimately see changes from Putin. I don't think he is suicidal. He wants to continue to rule, and he wants his country to remain allied with him. But it's not clear how quickly we will see turns because of how deeply entrenched his issues are in going into Ukraine and how rightfully entrenched the Ukrainians are in having the Russians depart and stop their offensive.
We've spent the bulk of our program today, Mara, talking about trade, whether it's with regard to China, the EU, or any other partner that is facing a deadline here coming up next month, whether it be the 1st or the 12th. And a lot of that talk has revolved around the idea of the taco trade, the fact that the markets are still near all-time highs despite the great uncertainty. And I wonder if there's an element of that here. Does Vladimir Putin actually believe that Donald Trump will go through with the threats that he's making?
Yeah, it's a fair question. And there's plenty of reason to see inconsistency in President Trump and his actions. And so both in terms of the economy and in terms of how other world leaders look at and assess the United States, it will be important for President Trump to be able to display and act with some degree of consistency and not, not pivot his positions by sometimes up to 180 degrees overnight. And again, we have too little in the mix now to know whether he's capable of doing that.
Well, as we consider President Trump's shifting positions, we saw a notable break yesterday between him and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on another issue, which is the situation with hunger in Gaza. Netanyahu obviously not characterizing it as starvation. President Trump says he begs to differ and thinks the images don't lie. But he also just said aboard Air Force One that he thinks Israel could do a good job with food centers in Gaza. How much do you expect the pressure on Netanyahu and Israel specifically to ramp up from President Trump?
Well, again, I think the question here is one of consistency, because while I appreciate the fact that he acknowledged the very real facts on the ground in terms of the human lives and the suffering that is occurring in Gaza, and was able to acknowledge that while Hamas has a role in that for sure, and brought all of this upon the people of Gaza, that Israel's actions are also culpable. He needs to be able to continue with that kind of approach and to present solution sets. And there are some within Israel who also want to see that, who have a different view than Prime Minister Netanyahu. Notable among those who would support some of the solution sets others are bringing forward of the Israeli military, who frankly wanted the original system of food distribution and humanitarian aid to continue and were overruled by the political elements of Prime Minister Netanyahu and those around him.